me see. Yeah, for whatever reason, my camera's not working. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our panel, and we've already lost a couple of minutes. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. We've got Aaron Marion, we've got Monica Campbell, and Aaron Marion. My apologies, but please tell me what university you're from. I don't have the program in front of me.
Hi, I'm Andrew Marion. I'm from the University of Mississippi.
Okay, thank you very much. And Monica Campbell is also from the University of Mississippi, and we've got Ryan Smith from the University of Arkansas. And so I think if I'm remembering the program correctly, Andrew, you're first. Is that correct? So I think what I'm going to do is, because I don't have, I do have the papers right here. Andrew's paper is James Eastland, Displaced Persons, Resettlement in Mississippi, 1848 to 1952. Monica Campbell is Good Business and Good for Business, Little Rock, J. William Fulbright, and Urban Renewal in 1950 to 1970. And Ryan Smith is of Material Benefit, Prison Labor, and State Infrastructure in Postwar, Arkansas, 1945 to 1980. So let's just go ahead and get started. And I would also say this, anything else you want to share about who you are and what you're doing, please feel free to take a minute to do that, since I don't have all the information in front of me. Andrew?
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. My name's Andrew Marion. I'm a PhD student at the University of Mississippi. And before we start, I want to thank the other panelists. I especially want to thank Monica Campbell, who kind of spearheaded putting this panel together. So I appreciate all of her work to put it together. And today I'm going to talk about James Eastland and Displaced Persons Resettlement in Mississippi, 1948 to 1952. In March 1949, Senator James O. Eastland's office received a letter from S.H. Kyle, a Clarksdale, Mississippi planter, who expressed interest in sponsoring the immigration of 10 families of European displaced persons, which sometimes I'll shorten that to DPs. Kyle explained he could offer these families good opportunities to become successful citizens, and he believed those DP families' thrift and free enterprise would be valuable to his farm. Similar inquiries from across Mississippi, especially the Delta, arrived in Eastland's office. Mississippians were eager to learn more about how DP resettlement could benefit their farms and businesses. So today I plan on showing how Senator James Eastland used the power of his office to help his Mississippi planter peers and constituents use the federal Displaced Persons Resettlement Program to exploit DP laborers and reimagine their relationship to the New Deal state. Specifically, Mississippi planters hope to replace black sharecroppers and tenant farmers with DPs, thus preventing or mitigating the effects of any future federal civil rights legislation or unionization efforts. Following the end of World War II, millions of refugees from Eastern Europe and Baltic nations crowded into Allied-controlled DP camps, with few, if any, options for returning to their homelands. President Harry Truman urged the U.S. Congress to pass DP resettlement legislation to address the burgeoning humanitarian crisis the DP camps posed. Congress did not pass relevant legislation until 1948 with the Displaced Persons Act, and it was later amended in 1950. The resulting federal program resettled nearly 400,000 displaced persons to the U.S. between August 1948 and August 1952, with approximately 2,750 initially resettling in Mississippi. The details of the DP Acts and the implementation of resettlement represented a confluence of humanitarian motivations arising from internationalist ideas of bringing the New Deal to the world, and capitalist motivations in which potential American DP sponsors and employers sought to exploit DP laborers. Eastland had aligned himself with the more restrictionist members of the Democratic Party related to immigration, notably Senator Pat McCarran, and he advocated for legislative provisions that discriminated against Jewish and Catholic DPs, and also codified good faith loyalty oaths to bind DPs to employers for as long as possible. On the surface of these kind of, at the macro level of the policy and legislative discussions, Eastland appeared opposed to DP resettlement. However, he did support his constituents' efforts to sponsor and exploit displaced persons, as long as they fit the religious, ethnic, and political characteristics that Eastland and his planter peers deemed suitable for resettlement in Mississippi. Prior to resettlement, displaced persons resettlement, Eastland had helped his planter constituents access German POW labor, strengthening his political ties to those planters and making clear his focus on providing them the labor and federal resources they asked for. Eastland pushed federal government and military officials to provide those POWs better accommodations and delay their repatriation to Europe following the end of the war. This work helped Eastland cultivate a stronger relationship with his constituents during his first few years in office, and many of the same planters would contact him for help once they learned they could sponsor displaced persons. And Eastland used similar methods to help Mississippi planters sponsor displaced persons. Whereas POW laborers were understood as temporary and their treatment had to meet certain standards due to international agreements, displaced persons arrived in the U.S. for long-term or permanent resettlement. The Federal DP Commission devoted most of their resources to their operations in Europe, and the commission typically deferred to local people, state officials, voluntary agencies, or religious organizations for any enforcement or oversight of the proper treatment of the displaced. Resettlement in Mississippi also represented a rare case where a bulk of the resettlements were not facilitated through a voluntary agency or religious group. Rather, one man, Colonel Albert T. Calicott, served as a broker for Mississippians seeking DP laborers, and Eastland's office worked with Calicott and provided him some legitimacy to the federal DP Commission. Calicott's position in the military and his post-war role gave him access to DP camps in Germany, and following multiple visits to the camps, Calicott began advertising DPs to his fellow planters in and around Senatobia, Mississippi, and throughout the state as a means to replace Black labor and create a permanent white workforce. Calicott hoped these DPs would remain in Mississippi for the long term and eventually apply for citizenship. Prospective Mississippi DP sponsors paid Calicott a fee to interview and select DPs for resettlement. James Eastland also worked with the Federal DP Commission and War Department to give 3 other Mississippians, J.P. Cole, William Yandell, and Allen Hobbs, special entry permits to the DP camps to survey them and decide which DPs were most suitable for resettlement. Calicott, in particular, following his time in the DP camps, selected Latvian displaced persons for resettlement to Mississippi, believing their Lutheran faith, work ethic, and agricultural experience would suit them well for life as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The first displaced persons arrived in Mississippi in November 1948 and resettled on Colonel Calicott's property in Senatobia, where local white residents greeted them with fanfare and a large welcome meal. However, Colonel Calicott had forced those DPs to sign tenancy contracts prior to leaving Europe that gave the Calicotts nearly total control over their lives and earnings. These contracts pushed a significant percentage of farm costs onto DPs, forced them to work in the off-season months without pay, and garnished a percentage of any wages earned off the Calicott property. The Calicotts also did not meet their own obligations pursuant to the contract, including failing to provide enough housing or livestock. These displaced families immediately fell into debt to the farm store because the harvest had ended, eliminating their ability to earn farm wages in their first few months in Mississippi. Now, in the early months of 1949, shortly after this first group of displaced persons arrived, Eastland's office began receiving more and more inquiries about resettlement, like S.H. Kyle's that I mentioned at the beginning. And he tasked his executive assistant, Virginia Simmerman, with organizing those files and responding appropriately to put those potential sponsors in touch with Calicott, the Federal DP Commission, or others. Delta and Pine Land Company, under the leadership of Oscar Johnston, who had previously worked with the federal government on New Deal agricultural policy, sponsored more DPs than any other Mississippi individuals or businesses. Calicott facilitated numerous large assurances for Delta and Pine Land, starting with an initial group of 38 families, which included at least 30 children and 100 able-bodied workers. Johnston remained in constant contact with Eastland throughout the resettlement process, asking Eastland to communicate with Calicot in Germany and reach out to federal DP Commission officials for special requests and to expedite their applications. Now, around the same time that first group of displaced persons arrived at Delta and Pine Land, investigations into mistreatment of DPs at the Calicot property in Senatobia nearly derailed resettlement in the state. Following the publication of news articles about the exploitation of DPs in Senatobia, two individuals advocating on behalf of DPs, Reverend Oswald Blumett of Washington, D.C., and Bill Sudduth, who had been raised in Mississippi but had relocated to New York City, traveled to the Calicot farm to meet with displaced persons there. They forwarded their observations, including accusations of low wages, poor housing, and other issues, to the federal DP Commission, which then asked the Mississippi State Committee for the Resettlement of Displaced Persons to investigate the matter. These state officials asked 3 local white Senatobians to visit the Calicot property and assess the situation. While those 3 investigators affirmed the Calicots had not fulfilled their contractual obligations to the displaced, they also suggested that Blumett and Sudduth deceived the displaced persons into signing the complaint letters. They also argued that, quote, if outside persons will not butt into things that are not their affairs, then the problems would be solved. And they proposed that Blumett and Sudduth be investigated for any connection with communist organization or if their thinking is on communist lines. Eastland then reached out to Ugo Carusi, the chairman of the Federal Displaced Persons Commission, to ignore Blumett and Sudduth's complaint. Carusi and the Federal DP Commission acquiesced, ending their investigations despite their persistent suspicions of Calicot. Thus, Eastland helped prevent federal officials from intervening in Calicot's operations. Calicot and other Mississippi DP sponsors participated in the program because they believed creating an exploitable DP workforce would prevent this type or any type of federal or outside intervention into their affairs and their businesses. Now, while Eastland could leverage his power to prevent the federal DP Commission from addressing the exploitation of DP sharecroppers, he could not stop voluntary agencies or individuals from providing relief to mistreated displaced persons in Mississippi. This occurred when Lauma Kazak, the president of the Wisconsin Latvian Association, began receiving multiple letters from displaced persons at Delta and Pine Land. A displaced man, Paulus Karklins, explained his wages were so low that he could not feed his family and that his son became seriously ill from a combination of malnutrition and exposure to hot weather. Another, Eisen Selms, claimed Delta and Pine Land had tried to push his family into, quote, debt and slavery, and he asked, where is justice, or have we been punished by God? Lauma Kazak traveled to Delta and Pine Land in Scott, Mississippi, met with Oscar Johnston, and paid off as many debts as she could of the displaced persons. She then took those families back with her to Wisconsin, where she found new sponsors for them to live with. Now, some of these interventions at Delta and Pine Land, as well as resettlement being effectively halted in Louisiana after months of investigation into mistreatment of DPs on sugar plantations, slowed down the pace of resettlement in Mississippi and across the U.S. South. Also, DPs who had initially arrived in Mississippi began leaving and relocating to cities, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast, where they could earn higher wages and live among immigrants with the same ethnic and national backgrounds. James Eastland continued advocating on behalf of Calicot, Delta and Pine Land, and other Mississippians seeking DP labor, but his political alignment with Senator Pat McCarran and his opposition to expanding the DP program put him at odds with many of his colleagues in the Senate, but not necessarily Mississippi planters. In fact, while the amended DP Act passed in 1950 eliminated some of the discriminatory provisions of the original act that McCarran and Eastland had supported, it also introduced a new good faith loyalty oath requirement for each DP to take before they left Europe. This oath intended to put sponsors at ease who worried DPs would leave them before they could make sufficient profits off their labor. And the oath reflected the broader anti-communist fears that influenced subsequent immigration and refugee legislation. Following the end of the DP resettlement program in 1952, many Mississippi DP sponsors recognized their failure to build a workforce of DPs to shield them from potential federal civil rights legislation and disruptions to the sharecropping and tenancy system. However, they did succeed in using this federal humanitarian program to meet their needs in the short term, and Eastland helped them to do so. Eastland would continue to prioritize the needs of his planter peers, especially as they continue to resist federal intervention and any attempts to dismantle Jim Crow. And I'll end with this one interesting piece about Eastland and refugees after the Displaced Persons Resettlement Program ended. Eastland voted against the Refugee Relief Act of 1953, which passed and was signed into law by President Eisenhower. But in 1956, Eastland became the only U.S. senator to sponsor the resettlement of refugees through that legislation. In fact, he sponsored 2 families, and both worked on his land as tenant farmers. However, he canceled his application for a 3rd family because of a supposed disagreement with that family, and the apparent feeling that he could get along with the help he already had. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Michael Pierce, and I'm on, and thanks to the SHA's help desk, they found a way to get me on to all of this. And before we go on with Monica's, I want to actually do the formal introduction of Andrew that I wasn't around to do. And Andrew Marion is a PhD candidate at the University of Mississippi. He's working with Jared Roll. He received his BA at Millsaps College in Jackson, his master's in higher education at University of Pennsylvania. And what we just heard is from Andrew's dissertation that analyzes the implementation of a post-war refugee resettlement program for European displaced persons. Specifically, he examines how American individuals and businesses leveraged their power over this humanitarian program to exploit displaced persons in order to protect their own economic self-interests, insulate themselves from trade unionism, and renegotiate their relationship with the New Deal state. So you can see how this fits into his larger project. And so right now we have to move on to the next paper, and that is Monica Campbell's. And her paper is entitled Good Business and Good for Business, Little Rock, J. William Fulbright, Urban Renewal, 1950 to 1970. And like Andrew Marion, Monica Campbell is a PhD candidate at the University of Mississippi, also working with the incredible Professor Roll. And Monica received her BA from University of Central Arkansas and her MA at Arkansas State. And this paper is part of a larger dissertation project that uses Little Rock as a case study to show how smaller cities helped to shape national urban policy in the decades following World War II. And she highlights the crucial role that white business and professional women played in shaping downtown redevelopment and revitalization. And she seeks to contribute to efforts to historicize neoliberalism and understand the role of smaller cities in this history of neoliberalism. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Monica Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pierce. Before I begin my paper, I would first like to thank the SHA for accepting this panel, and I would also like to thank all of the panel participants, and especially Drs. Pierce, Jones Branch, and Anderson for participating. So again, my paper is Good Business and Good for Business, Little Rock, J. William Fulbright, and Urban Renewal, 1950 to 1970. Senator J. William Fulbright spoke at Arkansas's first conference on planning, renewal, and housing at the Hotel Marion in Little Rock in mid-November 1959. Using the opportunity of his keynote address, Fulbright officially announced the gathering of elected city officials, planning commissioners, Housing Authority directors and staff members from across the state the Housing and Home Finance Administration's approval of Little Rock's application for federal assistance in renewing and rehabilitating the city's downtown business district, a project which would span a total of 490 acres. Little Rock's urban strategists, who had worked feverishly to ensure federal approval of their plans to revitalize the entire central business core as a means of salvaging the city's reputation for progressivism following the highly publicized events of the 1957 Central High crisis, eagerly awaited this announcement. The HHFA's approval made the Central Little Rock Project, or CLRP, the first urban renewal project in the nation authorized under the recently approved provisions of the Federal Housing Act of 1959, provisions which Senator Fulbright had helped to secure and which legally authorized Little Rock's urban strategists to revitalize their central business district. Illustrating Arkansas's mounting congressional influence during this period, Senator Fulbright played a central role both in promoting Little Rock's urban renewal initiatives on the national level and in pushing through amendments that allowed for total downtown renewal. Scholars interested in Fulbright's work tend to emphasize his contributions to education and foreign policy, particularly his opposition to the Vietnam War. Little analysis exists on his work in domestic politics outside of discussions centered on Fulbright's noted opposition towards civil rights legislation. However, since the beginning of his career in the United States Senate in 1945, Fulbright was intensely concerned with Arkansas's economic growth and persistently worked on behalf of business and industrial interests in his home state. And while Fulbright's role in establishing federal programs for international educational exchange is well documented, less well known is his legislative backing for the federal slum clearance and urban revitalization program, which began with his support of the Housing Act of 1949. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Fulbright assisted with securing federal slum clearance and urban renewal funds for numerous projects in Little Rock, and with promoting the development and implementation of similar projects in cities and towns throughout Arkansas. Much of this assistance came during his often overlooked four-year tenure as chairman of the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency, including his cooperation in pushing through the Senate proposed housing legislation to allow Little Rock urban strategists to implement the CLRP. This legislation became the Federal Housing Act of 1959. By 1960, Little Rock's urban strategists had helped to lay the foundations of what scholars now describe as the neoliberal city. Arkansas's and Little Rock's political and business leaders were hesitant about the federal government's growing power in the mid-20th century, and they resisted the changes in the Democratic Party that accompanied that growth. Nevertheless, they sought to harness the federal state to facilitate commercial development during this period. Through their efforts to secure federal money, Arkansas's congressional delegation and business leaders facilitated a public-private partnership that fostered private economic investment and industrial growth in their state. And as the congressional delegation and the state's business leaders continued to guide federally underwritten private investment into Arkansas, cities like Little Rock became increasingly important beneficiaries of those federal dollars. Building upon a federal-state coalition between Arkansas and the nation's capital that had emerged under the New Deal during the 1930s, local businessmen and city planners maintained regular correspondence with Arkansas's congressional representatives, keeping them apprised of Little Rock's urban renewal program and lobbying them to support legislation and also federal appointees that would advance the city's interests. Like industrial boosters on the state level, Little Rock's urban strategists prioritized economic development in their renewal program for the city. In doing so, the city's business and civic leaders, like their counterparts elsewhere throughout the country, particularly in the South and West, looked to Washington to bankroll the development of local infrastructure to, as one scholar has put it, quote, shepherd growth and encourage the rational development of business, industry, and housing, end quote. When Congress passed the 1949 Housing Act, creating the Federal Slum Clearance and Urban Redevelopment Program, the Little Rock City Council saw an opportunity to quote historian John Kirk, lure industries and provide improvements within white areas of the city. Moving quickly, city officials applied for federal funds under the new housing law and presented a $359,000 bond issue, which was ostensibly created to develop a public African-American park on the southeast edge of the city to meet the matching local funds requirement for the grant. The application was successful, and Little Rock became one of the first cities in the nation awarded a federal grant under the 1949 legislation. With federal funding secured, Little Rock's urban developers created redevelopment plans that worked to remove Black residents from prime downtown real estate in the belief that establishing predominantly white communities in the downtown area would bolster the city's chances of attracting new industries and ensure the central business district's prosperity. And although a smaller metropolitan area, Little Rock quickly arose as a forerunner in urban renewal. The city's first venture, called the Dunbar Project, was the third slum clearance and urban rehabilitation project in the country, and the first in the Southwest, specifically meaning west of the Mississippi, approved and initiated under the Federal Housing Act of 1949. A few years later, Little Rock's Philander Smith project became the first urban renewal project in the nation, approved and initiated under the Federal Housing Act of 1954. That act changed the program from urban rehabilitation to urban renewal, and Philander Smith was the first project approved under it. Soon after, local urban strategists formed the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission of Pulaski County, known colloquially as MetroPlan, which the HHFA praised as a potential national model for regional planning. Senator Fulbright played a key role in the approval of both the Philander Smith project and MetroPlan. Fulbright had assumed the chairmanship of the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency in January 1955, and as he did so, offered his cooperation to Little Rock urban strategists. And as local urban renewal interests enlisted grassroots support for area planning in the greater Little Rock area, that's where the women came in. Senator Fulbright pushed for the passage of MetroPlan's federal grant. And on July 1st, 1955, local businessman Raymond Resettlement informed his friend in Washington that, quote, "Our Metropolitan Area Planning Commission can now get going in full as a result of the grant which you so ably assisted in securing," end quote. Fulbright lent his weight to the LRHA application for the Philander Smith project as well, and that same month, the HHFA approved it. Little Rock slum clearance and urban renewal endeavors were so influential that the city became one of 9 to receive a Look magazine award in April 1957, remember that year, for, quote, "making the greatest accomplishments in home achievements," end quote. And the city was also selected to host the American Planning and Civic Association's National Citizens Planning Conference, or NCPC, that summer. So the Central High crisis coming in September overshadowed the city's urban renewal program when Governor Orville Eugene Faubus called out the Arkansas National Guard to block 9 Black students from desegregating the high school. And while many saw a crisis, Little Rock's urban strategists saw opportunity. They led the charge to use urban renewal to rebuild the city's reputation in the aftermath of the highly publicized events surrounding school desegregation, and coordinated with Arkansas's congressional representatives in Washington to push for federal approval of a new downtown renewal project. So amid the school crisis, LRHA, the Little Rock Housing Authority Director, Knox Banner, presented the Central Little Rock Project, which was first revealed at the 1957 NCPC, as the only available tool for rebuilding the city's image in the wake of the school crisis. And as owners of downtown retail businesses, Many of Little Rock's key business leaders had a strong personal interest in both preventing the decline of the central business district and maintaining the city's reputation as, quote, an acknowledged leader in urban renewal, particularly in central city renewal and neighborhood rehabilitation, end quote. On January 29th, 1959, Banner, Rebsamen, Winthrop Rockefeller, and 37 other local business leaders joined to form the Urban Progress Association Incorporated to work with the LRHA, the Little Rock Chamber of Commerce, and local planning commissions to, quote, promote commercial and industrial growth primarily, but also cultural development and a healthy residential development and redevelopment, end quote. In addition to helping mobilize Little Rock's business community, Banner spent the bulk of the 2-year school crisis lobbying in Washington, D.C. to extend federal urban renewal guidelines to permit the inclusion of the entire downtown commercial area in a renewal project. So up until this point, federal legislation only allowed about 10% of funding for renewal to go toward non-residential renewal and rehabilitation. So Banner and Little Rock urban strategists they're important for expanding that allowance. So during this 2-year span, Banner served as one of several housing officials who testified that urban renewal was essential for the survival of the nation's cities. That work on the ground in Little Rock and in Washington led to the 1959 Amendment of National Policy. Senator Fulbright kept a close eye on these developments from Washington, and although he had stepped down as chairman of the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency in January, Fulbright continued to advocate for Little Rock's urban renewal program and ensured priority status for both the city's renewed Workable program and its application for urban renewal funds under the new housing measures. When the HHFA authorized the CLRP under the Federal Housing Act of 1959, Little Rock became the first city in the country to designate its entire central business district as an urban renewal area. The CLRP created opportunities for some of Little Rock's urban strategists to take expanded national roles while advocating urban renewal as, quote, good business and good for business. For example, as a testament to the city's influence in urban renewal, businessmen in the nation's capital recruited Knox Banner to head their own downtown progress in 1960. Banner accepted and moved to DC, where he, quote, became the evangelist of delivery from urban decay. And at the same time, cities throughout Arkansas and the Sun Belt South sent delegates to examine Little Rock's urban renewal programs firsthand. And in fact, the city became an important workshop for how to implement these policies. Meanwhile, Fulbright and local urban strategists ensured that the Little Rock model remained at the vanguard of national urban renewal with the 1961 appointment of William L. Slayton as Urban Renewal Administrator and Rodney A. Bethune as HHFA Regional Administrator in Fort Worth. And as a result of Senator Fulbright's, Banner's, and others' work in Washington, Little Rock's urban renewal program impacted federal legislation as it helped to reshape national urban policy. The CLRP had effectively redefined urban renewal by shifting the focus from primarily residential projects underscoring social needs to a program of federally funded downtown renewal that allowed for a growing emphasis on private economic development in the nation's central cities. And public-private cooperation, moreover, became an important element in both Presidents John Kennedy's and Lyndon Johnson's domestic policies. And indeed, by 1968, both Robert C. Weaver, who was the first African-American cabinet secretary appointed to head HUD, and President Johnson reinforced these market-based policies as they argued that, quote, business-government cooperation is central to the achievement of America's goals, end quote, and that only through this creative federalism, as Johnson called it, could the Great Society be realized. And this argument, as one historian explains, reflected a growing recognition among the nation's business leaders of the economic potential of Johnson's Great Society programs, and Little Rock offered a homegrown example for how to apply those market-based concepts to the nation's urban problems. And as the first such venture awarded federal sanction, the Central Little Rock Project became a national model for implementing this urban policy. So in conclusion, in early 1950, Little Rock, Arkansas became one of the first cities in the United States to initiate an urban renewal program under the Federal Housing Act of 1949. And over the course of 2 decades, the city's urban strategists had restructured the purpose of such social programs as public housing to a market-based initiative or objective. They prioritized private business interests and local practices of strategic planning and urban design, and created a coalition of public and private interests housed in a metropolitan institution and tasked with employing a boosterist agenda to promote place marketing and intermunicipal cooperation. With the help of congressional delegates like Senator J. William Fulbright, the Little Rock Plan gained prestige as a national model for urban renewal, highlighting the city's significance not only in Arkansas, but in the nation for the decisions its leaders made with urban renewal. These decisions, moreover, helped to shape national legislation, further shifting the emphasis of federal housing policy from public housing to urban renewal, and foreshadowed the wide-scale transition toward neoliberal urban governance in the 1970s. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And now for our final paper, it's Ryan Anthony Smith of the University of Arkansas. And the title of his paper is Of Material Benefit, Prison Labor and State Infrastructure in Postwar Arkansas, 1945 to 1980. Ryan Smith is a PhD candidate at the University of Arkansas. He received his MA in history from Arkansas State and his BA from UCA. Right now, Ryan Smith is writing a history of the Arkansas penitentiary system from its inception, I assume in the 1830s, to the present. He focuses on labor, prisoner rights, and reforms. Arkansas's prisons, although seemingly modeled on the plantation model, were businesses that utilized the latest technologies and management strategies to maximize profit and enrich the state. And what Ryan looks at in his dissertation is in many ways how these inmates at these labor camps and in these prisons harnessed what limited power they had and confronted and critiqued state power through both violent and nonviolent means. So without further ado, let's hear from Ryan Anthony Smith. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. And again, thank you to everyone that Monica and Andrew both mentioned. I also want to thank the Agricultural History Society for sponsoring the panel today. As Dr. Pierce mentioned, my paper is entitled Of Material Benefit, Prison Labor and State Infrastructure in Postwar Arkansas, 1945 to 1980. On May 15, 1968, an F4 tornado tore through Jonesboro, Arkansas, killing 34, injuring another 300 and destroying over 150 homes. The tornado was one of many that swept across the Midwest on the 15th and 16th. Almost immediately, help flowed in from across the state, especially from local and state governments, religious institutions, and charities. Among those lending a hand were inmates from Cummins Prison, the state's largest penitentiary. 21 men spent over 2 weeks cleaning up debris, rebuilding infrastructure, and tending to victims' needs. In addition, the men contributed some of their own money to start a fund to support those affected. Locals described their work as indispensable, and city and county officials presented each man with a certificate of commendation. Despite their labors, they were not compensated. Prison labor has resurfaced in public dialogue very recently. California has sent hundreds of inmates to fight out-of-control wildfires in recent years, which has saved the state hundreds of thousands of dollars as inmates are paid less than the state's minimum wage. Perhaps ironically, those inmates upon release do not qualify to become firefighters in most jurisdictions in the state because they have a criminal record. 8 states, however, do not pay inmates at all for their labor, and all are concentrated in the South. Arkansas is one such state, and throughout its history, its penitentiary system has focused on creating wealth for the state and various private industries. In short, the Arkansas prison system is first and foremost a business. Most studies of prison labor focus almost exclusively on the era of convict leasing. During this period, which varied in practice and success across the South, inmates were leased to private companies who forced them into labor camps where they mined, built railroads, fired bricks, and constructed state buildings. As scholars have pointed out, prison labor was central to building a new South, led by wealthy capitalists who hoped to rapidly urbanize and industrialize the region, as was happening in northern cities. But conditions for inmates, who were overwhelmingly African American, were appalling, and the practice was abolished in the early 20th century. That, however, did not end prison labor, nor spell an improvement in conditions for inmates, at least not in Arkansas. In fact, it didn't even end leasing. In 1921, a report showed that prison officials were continuing to feed inmates to private industries despite leasing being effectively banned in 1913. But even those who remained inside prison walls continued working for public and private entities. With the system now fully under state control, inmates worked on state projects, building and refurbishing prison structures, tending crops to sell to fill state coffers, and sometimes laboring on infrastructure outside prison walls. These projects were intended to either directly enrich the state financially or to save money. Even though convict leasing was illegal, prison officials signed deals with private businesses for inmates to perform labor, usually on prison grounds, that was significantly cheaper than hiring employees. At the same time, private industries regularly sold everything from seed to farm implements to prisons. This accelerated during the post-World War II economic boom. By 1957, the state had hired a business manager for its 2 prisons, after several consecutive years of operating at or near a loss. Eugene Nunn, the state's first manager, advertised surplus seed, heads of cattle, and scrap metal in local and out-of-state publications, selling each to the highest bidder. He organized the sale of 1,055 bales of cotton grown at Cummins and Tucker, which is the other state prison in Arkansas, at the Pine Bluff Cotton Exchange. In March 1957, he leased out 125 acres at both Cummins and Tucker to Atkins Pickle Company to grow cucumbers, with all the labor to be performed by unpaid inmates. Nunn and Jim Brutton, the director of the Tucker prison farm, even traveled to Atkins to attend, quote, cucumber school to learn about the pickling process. For the National Oats Company of Iowa, he leased out acreage to grow popcorn. At the same time, Nunn sought out the latest in agricultural technology at the lowest price to maximize profits. In March 1958, he struck a deal with a mill in Morrilton to buy cottonseed oil at a huge discount. The following month, Nunn landed a great deal on a cotton baler from a local seller, along with an array of mechanized farm tools. A local agricultural company agreed to let the Tucker prison use their mules, feed, and equipment in exchange for half of all crops produced that growing season, in an effort to save money and also introduce inmates to more advanced farm implements and growing strategies. When disaster struck parts of the state, inmates were commonly sent to help with the cleanup and rebuilding process. In the same year that Jonesboro was hit, inmates were sent to assist another storm hit after another storm hit Dumas, a small town in Deshay County bordering the Mississippi River, where they earned commendations from city officials. Although a small minority of inmates at Cummins, women at the Women's Reformatory also worked for state benefit. They made all the clothing for those incarcerated at the prison and were often charged with cooking, cleaning, laundering clothes, and tending vegetable gardens and chickens. Although the practice was illegal, Black women were frequently sent to work as house servants for prison officials who lived on prison grounds. Prison officials also had to keep their labor force in line and frequently used incentives and punishments to keep inmates working. Those who worked diligently and did not resist were often promoted to trustee, and trustees were armed inmates charged with overseeing the prison's day-to-day operations. At the same time, trustees could lose their position for failing to guarantee efficiency. One such trustee was transferred from Tucker to Cummins, a definite demotion as conditions at Cummins were consistently worse than at Tucker. He was transferred from Tucker to Cummins for sleeping on a shift and, quote, attempting to persuade inmates into a sit-down strike. Another was removed from his position for allowing other inmates to tear up plumbing and supplying them with cigarettes and matches. Inmates who did not comply with officials' orders would be sent back to work in the fields. Some inmates lost privileges to sell blood plasma for cash. Others were kicked out of a traveling prison band known as the OEBs for insubordination. Although images of the state's prisons seem to resemble 19th century plantations, prisoners, mostly Black, hunched over rows of cotton with sacks covering their backs, while armed prison guards on horseback oversee their progress. These institutions were modern and their operations diverse, but inmates challenged the terms of their confinement and the brutal labor regimen they endured. Sometimes this took the form of strikes, work stoppages, or even violence against staff. Inmates, though, more often used more conventional channels to protest their living and working conditions. They told their stories to reporters and investigators, formed inmate panels that spoke to people on the outside about life inside prison, and worked in communities devastated by disasters, in part to improve the image of inmates with the public. In May 1969, a group of inmates threatened to strike. They sent a petition signed by 259 men to Arkansas Governor Winthrop Rockefeller, promising a work stoppage unless their demands were met. Signatories complained about 11-hour workdays and working 6 days per week. Food was hardly edible and personal laundry was grossly inadequate. Quote, "It's not just the sanitation," one signer complained. "It's demoralizing for a man to be served unclean food, and we have been working 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. 5 days a week and 7 till 5 on Saturdays." These inmates believed that the only way to draw attention to conditions was to threaten a sit-down strike. The director of the Arkansas Department of Corrections, Robert Sarver, drove to Cummins and listened to inmate complaints for several hours before assuring them that improvements were coming, but that the prison was operating at a loss. Inmates did not strike, but they had effectively alerted state officials that they were willing to shut down operations if their demands were not met. Inmates also took to their prison newspaper, the Pickers-Picayune, to organize and make demands of prison officials. A May 1968 letter to the editor insisted the prison purchase more books for the library, or at least allow inmates to use commissary funds to purchase them. Others asked why educational programs, religious instruction, and psychological counseling were not part of the prison experience. That would mean, according to inmate Gene Hall, quote, "there would be less and less of us who would ever be called inmate again." Although a small minority of inmates at Cummins, female inmates at the women's reformatory were sometimes featured in the paper. Mary Young, an inmate at the reformatory, asked why she had not been granted clemency, even though she had been a model inmate, and demanded an answer. Inmates also sought to humanize themselves with readers on the outside, in part to gain support for prison reforms. They used opportunities to leave prisons and help with state projects like disaster cleanup to change the minds of those on the outside who viewed prisoners as menaces. Numerous residents wrote letters to prison officials and inmates thanking them for their work. Dumas city officials even sent a letter praising prisoners. Quote, "We are unable to find words to say just how much we appreciate this act of kindness." Inmate panels set out across the state to speak with free people about the struggles prisoners face. While they hoped to discourage kids from committing crimes and ending up in the state penitentiary, inmates on the panel also hoped to improve their own image. Quote, "A panel member is a living human being, and as such is called by his real name rather than a number." As one inmate summarized, "The Arkansas prison system is desperate to rebuild, perhaps for the first time, a good image to the public." Prison activism in Arkansas came to a head in 1970 with the Holt versus Sarver decision. Although Governor Winthrop Rockefeller promised to reform Arkansas's prisons, and Johnny Cash had performed a concert at Cummins in support of reform, inmates themselves led the effort for substantive change. Several inmates filed suit in federal court, alleging that confinement in Arkansas's prisons constituted cruel and unusual punishment. A federal judge agreed and declared the entire Arkansas penal system unconstitutional, ordering the state to massively overhaul its prison facilities and practices. Despite the Holt decision and the movement for prisoners' rights, Arkansas continues to use forced labor. Inmates still work for public and private entities for no pay. Some even work in the governor's mansion. They continued to grow crops on prison grounds while overseers on horseback threatened them with solitary confinement if they lag. But these prisons are businesses, and they are advanced. They harness the latest technologies and strategies to suck as much labor out of inmates as possible. Inmates find ways, however, to push back, to assert their humanity, and to demand reform, just as they have done for decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Now we're going to move on to commentary. We have two commentators, and I will introduce them in order. The first is Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch. She is the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Professor of History and Dean of the Graduate School at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro. This year, she's also an American Council on Education Lumina Fellow at the University of Central Arkansas. Professor Jones-Branch is a native of Charleston, South Carolina. She received both her BA and her MA from the College of Charleston, and she received her doctorate in the finest school to study Southern history there is, the Ohio State University. Dr. Jones-Branch is the author of Crossing the Line, Women in Interracial Activism in South Carolina, and she is co-editor of Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times. Her most recent book, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas, is now available. It's just out from the University of Arkansas Press. She's currently working on another book on the American Farm Bureau Federation and African Americans. And lastly, she wants me to add that Professor Jones-Branch is a veteran of the U.S. war in the Persian Gulf. So why don't you take it away, Dr. Jones-Branch, and then I'll introduce David Anderson.
Excellent, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I've got my comments on my computer, so if I look like I'm looking away or whatever, it's only because I'm reading my comments, which I didn't have time to print out. But I wanted to start by thanking Monica for inviting me to participate on this panel, and thank you to the Agricultural History Society for sponsoring it. I'm very honored to be here and proud to say that Ryan Smith and Monica Campbell are both former graduate students of mine. I chaired Ryan's master's thesis and I served on Monica's master's thesis. And also that they make me in the history department at Arkansas State University look like we might actually know what we're doing. As I read these three papers, all of which focus on Southern states with difficult histories, one question kept coming to mind, actually a couple of questions. I wanted to know, where are the Black voices? What was their reaction to these events in Mississippi and Arkansas? So to start with Mr. Marion, when you talked about displaced persons resettling in Mississippi, I wondered if you had uncovered any evidence of resistance from African Americans, for whom agricultural labor had long been their livelihood. I wondered also if the Mississippi Negro Farm Bureau members discussed this in their meetings. I am certain the Mississippi Farm Bureau Federation did, but were Black members privy to these conversations? I additionally wanted to know, how did Black newspapers talk about the impact of the federal displaced person settlement program at a time when many, but certainly not all, African Americans were resettling themselves in other parts of the nation? As I read Ms. Campbell's paper about J. William Fulbright and urban renewal, I wanted to know if African Americans projected an alternative vision for urban renewal. I understand that some of Little Rock's Black political leaders applauded this as increased opportunities for African Americans, but were there discussions about what was lost as their communities were dismantled and people, businesses, and cultural institutions were displaced? And Little Rock's Black political leaders did not represent all African Americans. I know from reading your paper and your footnotes that Black women protested things like the Dunbar Project, as did African American civil rights activists. but that highly visible individuals and organizations like the NAACP or the Urban League criticized urban renewal. And what did the Arkansas State Press, the largest Black-owned newspaper in Arkansas, or in Little Rock rather, have to say about this? Did they support or did it resist urban renewal? And finally, Mr. Smith, I always want to know more about Black women in prison situations. How did you factor them into your discussion about prison labor and state infrastructure? And you talked about this a little bit, but I was also curious to know things like who agitated on their behalf? What forces were at work in Arkansas to challenge the business of the prison system? If you're talking about Black women, what did the Arkansas Association of Colored Women have to say about this? What about the NAACP? Also, how was prison activism in Arkansas in the late 1960s and early 1970s impacted by the Black Power movement? Because there was a Black Power movement that was particular to Arkansas. So I say all that to say, I enjoyed reading these papers and digging into the new knowledge these scholars are creating. I especially enjoyed the brief diversion from my graduate school dean responsibilities. And for that in particular, I thank you because I am first and foremost a historian. However, I find the work that these scholars are producing very exciting because it compels us to deeply question what many at the time thought were sound decisions and to wrestle with their impact on their communities, and it forces them to wrestle with the impact on their communities then and now. Thank you.
Before we give Monica and Ryan and Andrew a chance to respond, we're going to hear from our second commentator, David M. Anderson, who is Associate Professor and the William Thompson Endowed Professor in the School of History and Social Science at Louisiana Tech. Professor Anderson is a PhD. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2002. His current projects examine deindustrialization in the rural South and the radicalization of white people as a result, and also the rise of a new urban global American South. So without further ado, Professor David Anderson.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you again. And thank you to Monica and the rest of the panel for inviting me to take part in this. I agree with Dr. Jones-Branch that these papers, all three of them, show just what good work is being done, and particularly into parts of the South that we didn't know that well, and bringing it to the fore. And I'll talk a bit more about this or get going here so we have some time for questions and that. I'll start with Ryan's paper. Like all three, it uncovers and reveals a part of the South that wasn't that well known. There's the work as you point out on convict labor and turn of the century labor that Lichtenstein has done and others. What I was thinking of for this paper, and this kind of goes for all three of them, is that how do you connect these stories and these narratives and narrative arc to a larger theoretical project, and so I was just thinking of some possibilities is, how do you view prison labor? Is it something special, or is it like work, it's just in a different environment? And that would be a labor history paper. I also thought, and so do you see the job actions like strikes and that as, similar to other workers? Are they workers just in a different environment? The same way that when we started looking at slavery with the new labor history and new African American history and taking that this is work and it needs to be studied as work and the administration needs to be studied as managers. The other thing is possibly, and this is specific to yours, is to connect it to a more of a historical background and even to the moments in cultural history where the Arkansas prison system is exposed to the world, like the film like Brubaker and the character, the real life person that was based on, or the Arkansas prison blood scandal. And, these are moments when people are, we're led into it, and how do they connect it to it? The obvious point here is we're in the midst of this mass incarceration and prison industrial complex. It's a wave of scholarship. And where does your work fit into it? And that seems to me the most logical connection is when you take all that work, where do you position yourself? And finally, you say this is a business. There's that I.L. Press's new book called Dirty Work. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but his argument is that prisons are actually very poor mental health facilities, and prison guards are mental health workers. And this is really their function in society today. And that's what mass incarceration does. And I would look at something like that. But again, where can you place this work in a larger theoretical framework? Let me go through all three of them, and then if you want to respond to those, that'll be great. Is that okay, Michael? I'll go through all three. Okay. Andrew, another great story and a narrative. I asked every one of my colleagues, I was like texting people, said, have you ever heard of this? Not one of them has heard this story about the displaced persons. And, I would second Dr. Jones-Branch's comments on what did Black Mississippians make of this. And a few things in the narrative can be clarified. One thing I'm unsure of is you say there was an initial article that detailed the exploitation of the DPs. But how did that happen? That's one thing why did that first article come out? But I think more important, I think it's hard with this piece, is to tease out the implications of this, this story, this yarn or this anecdote, and analyze it and connect it to a historiographical theme. And, so I've been racking my brains about this, obviously one theme is, the Cold War communist refugees. These were supposed to be the good refugees, right? The ones that we take care of, and they're symbolic of, especially when the Cold War begins, of the tyranny of the Soviet Union. You would think we would take better care of them, and especially like the Southern senators like Eastland, who, appears in Ira Katz Nelson, Fear Itself, like he's the one who's, against or doesn't want like blacks to vote because that would dilute the soldier voting. And, so he's one of these Southerners who are defending the New Deal. And yet this is a story of the South that we don't see that fits into the New Deal. I was even thinking of Michael Ibarra. I think it's Washington Gone Crazy about Pat McCarran and McCarran's concern about communism and communist refugees. And the other, so that's one thing you could do. Or, something connected to the end of sharecropping and just sort of how this is, a failed transition, which I think is a theme in all of these papers, this transition from the Jim Crow South to the Sun Belt South. But I would it's such a good story. And I think if you can connect it to something larger, you'll have accomplished something here. All right. So now to Monica Campbell's paper, which again, I spent a lot of time talking to colleagues about neoliberalism and the neoliberal city. There's something about Arkansas, because I'm thinking about and how it explains a lot of the world we live in today. Like Perkins's book on the Ozarks, Michael, your books on Clinton and your stuff on Clinton and the New Democrats, and now Monica's work on Little Rock. And so if we just look at Arkansas, we'll understand, America today. That's all we have to do. And so that's, I think, the brilliance of this. I also think, so the transformation of the urban and rural South is one of the major stories in American history in the second half of the 20th century. And, and even into the present. and especially for those of us that live here, there's been just profound changes in both the rural and the urban areas. And we especially need is analysis of the second tier cities like Little Rock or my own Shreveport, which is nearby, or Chattanooga. Some of these cities have figured it out, like Chattanooga is kind of booming now. Shreveport isn't. Little Rock, I don't know. And that's one question I think you have to answer. Like your paper, panel mate's paper, it's extremely well researched, well written. The one thing I would say, and I don't get here, and I was even looking at your blog on the Metropole, is what actually happens to downtown, to Little Rock. There's no description here of what is built and what is torn down. And what I visited for Little Rock for the first time, must have been in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And to me, it was a rather blighted and dilapidated place. Where was the urban renewal? And so describing actually what is torn down, maps would help, or pictures, or the changes. The other thing is that the merits of this paper are many. It demonstrates a knowledge of the current historiography and this new wave of political and urban history. Works like Shaped by a State or Capital Gains, the Kim Philip Fine work, that stuff. The Shrugru thing on neoliberal cities, the book on neoliberal Chicago. As I see it, there's sort of one school of thought on the urban South is that the move to the suburbs is like Kevin Cruz's Atlanta, Lassiter's Charlotte, Phillips' White Metropolis. Where does Little Rock fit in these models? And I'm going to get ahead of myself here because urban renewal seems to be a big failure, and it was seen as sort of a last gasp of liberalism. What you're saying here is that urban renewal was a Trojan horse for neoliberalism. And I would really make that point. Now, that said, urban renewal more recently, why it has been depicted as an unqualified failure, Elizabeth Cohen's book, the Bancroft Prize-winning book on Ed Logue, she is trying to salvage urban renewal. And again, like the other papers, I would confront this historiography and confront that premise, or be more explicit about what you're saying about urban renewal. That you call it a foundation or a foreshadow. I would even, be a little more specific on what you mean there, on its connection to neoliberalism. Because we're still in a debate about neoliberalism that hasn't been resolved. Finally, to me, last thing, is that Little Rock, to me, fails to become a neoliberal city. It's not Nashville. It's not Charlotte. It's not Atlanta. The impetus or the inspiration to make it, to privatize things and do this may have been there, but there's something with neoliberalism that indicates it turns it into this hipster yuppie paradise. It becomes Austin. And that doesn't happen with Little Rock. And that should, to me, I think should be kind of the arc, that there's a failure of neoliberalism somewhere, and that you may want to address. All right, that's my comments.
So maybe we can give the panelists a chance to respond, and let's go in the order that you gave your papers. Andrew, Marion, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I really appreciate y'all's comments and these questions, which are helpful as I continue revising, adding more to the project, thinking more broadly about kind of the bigger payoff of this part of the project and other parts. Dr. Jones Branch, you asked about the Black voices here in this story. In Mississippi here, the sources I've kind of examined, it seems that many of the sponsors tried to keep displaced persons away from Black laborers, to kind of put them in housing and separate kind of areas of if they were on a larger plantation. But some of the displaced persons who wrote kind of diaries would write about other Black laborers that they worked alongside, but they usually weren't working directly with them. As far as kind of resistance from Black laborers about the idea of bringing in displaced persons, I don't necessarily see that as much in Mississippi. In most cases, it was just a family or two or three of displaced persons. The one kind of difference would be at Delta and Pine Land, which had at one point a total of 356 displaced persons working at Delta and Pine Land. And the way that Delta and Pine Land envisioned using those displaced persons were to kind of funnel them into supervisory positions, and that it was perceived that they would be better laborers for mechanization, that these Latvian displaced persons would be more capable of running the tractors, for example. But another part of that is the publications that first talked about the mistreatment of displaced persons. They were kind of sent out nationally, and they both critiqued the mistreatment of displaced persons, but they also made larger arguments about the problems with plantation agriculture, sharecropping, and tenancy. So they were really attacking the entire kind of agricultural system of the South, which just made those displaced person sponsors even more angry. But even with that, some of the members of the Federal Displaced Persons Commission worked pretty closely with the NAACP, specifically Walter White, and there were kind of communication back and forth about what was going on in Mississippi, with Walter White kind of encouraging the Federal Displaced Persons Commission to conduct more investigations, but they simply didn't have the manpower, and they just ended up deferring to Mississippi officials or Louisiana officials, where there were quite a lot of complaints there as well. But the difference being resettlement in Louisiana was facilitated through the Catholic Church, and Catholic officials in New Orleans and then others in New York City basically told Catholic officials in parishes, you have to stop defending these sugar plantation owners. We're going to take all the displaced persons out of Louisiana and move them elsewhere, because this is all of the investigations were revealing horrible mistreatment, but there wasn't any kind of intervention to help Black workers in those areas. And there was also kind of an ethnographic study during the middle of the displaced persons program from a researcher at LSU who happened to be a German immigrant, and he traveled throughout Mississippi and Louisiana. But he kind of repeated the arguments of planters, claiming that displaced persons, when on these plantations, automatically made these kind of sharecropper homes so much better, and that they were so much better workers, kind of denigrating Black laborers. In some ways, I think, to kind of boost this kind of project that displaced persons could replace Black laborers. And just really briefly, Dr. Anderson, you kind of ask about the broader themes of the project and how this fits in. My dissertation includes a chapter on resettlement in the South, but it also includes 2 other case studies, in addition to 2 other chapters. But I look at resettlement in California, which was very much facilitated by a committee of state officials, labor union officials, agribusiness, religious leaders, and the intent there was to provide agribusiness with replacements for Mexican migrant workers. And they planned to use it as experiments to see if that would persist and work. It didn't quite work because they weren't able to bring over enough displaced persons. And also have a case study in Minnesota, which is a bit more about building up kind of ethnic and immigrant identity in the Twin Cities. But the broader theme that I'm trying to tease out is how domestic economic concerns ended up dictating and defining the scope of American humanitarianism, even in this kind of early post-war period. That really was the driving force for why the United States was even resettling these displaced persons in the first place, because Americans could profit off of their labor.
Yeah, a colleague
Okay.
of mine just pointed out that like Stephen Porter's book and that Benevolent Empire, is that kind of the inspiration for this? And
Yes, he includes a chapter on displaced persons in Mississippi and Louisiana.
right, yeah.
Okay, I want to go on and give Monica and then Ryan a chance to respond to these comments. Go ahead, Monica.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Jones-Branch, both for your comments and questions. The audio is breaking up really bad on my end, so I hope I heard your whole questions, and I will do my best to answer them. I'll start with Dr. Jones-Branch's comments. The question about where are the Black voices. This is definitely something that I explore more in the larger dissertation project. I was really struggling to cut this story down for this paper in a way that made sense. But pretty much from the jump on starting the urban renewal program, there was contention, and there were discussions raised by poor and working class African Americans about urban renewal plans. So yes, like Dr. Jones-Branch pointed out, the Black elites were not the overriding voice for the African American community in Little Rock, but a lot of them initially supported urban renewal plans, including the state press. I found a couple of articles in the Arkansas State Press, the Bates's paper, that initially kind of supported this program because they were promised that these programs were going to help create better living conditions for local African Americans. They soon found out really quickly that that wasn't the case. So for example, the Dunbar project, that was one of those, it's a little patch of area, and kind of for Dr. Anderson's comments, I have maps of these, but unfortunately my technology is not good enough to support showing them, or I would have loved to. But the Dunbar project area is kind of a little L-shaped area within downtown Little Rock, close to the Central Business District, and it was primarily African American. So the plan was to move essentially this population, declare the residences there blighted. Most of them weren't, and a lot of them, the occupants actually owned the homes. And then they urban renewal strategists wanted to move the people who were living in the Dunbar area literally to the outskirts of Little Rock at the time. So the southeast area of the city, in an area called Gillum Park. That's where they wanted to move them to. During the Great Depression, it was actually an area for the city to move transients and homeless people to. So initial kind of debates about that began with actually the housewives living in the Dunbar project area. They were mobilizing the common housewife trope of the time, trying to defend their home, saying, "We own this home, why are you taking it away from us?" kind of thing. And I believe it was a representative from the NAACP and maybe one from the local urban league actually filed court cases against the project, and the courts ruled in favor of the project anyway, and it went ahead as planned. Another instance of these kind of discussions and pushback from the Black community against urban renewal was in the 60s, when Little Rock is kind of at the zenith of its influence for national urban renewal. Ozell Sutton and, sorry, the name just escaped me, but Arkansas Council on Human Relations member Ozell Sutton helped to file a complaint to HUD on housing discrimination against the LRHA and against the urban renewal program in 1964. And originally, again, Robert Weaver was the head of the department at this time, and originally they found in favor of Little Rock's urban planners. But then another suit was filed in 1966 after HUD was created, and I'm not entirely sure what the change was there. I'm thinking maybe it was because the department finally got created and there was a cabinet position made. The 1966 case, the Little Rock urban strategists lost that one. And so as a result, it was decided that MetroPlan can no longer be a citizens advisory committee, and appointing MetroPlan as a citizens advisory committee for urban renewal was kind of the city's workaround for having equal participation for the people who they were moving. So it was their way of getting token Black representation on their citizens participation committees. In terms of what is torn down, again, you have residences that urban renewal officials decide are blighted. Not all of them are, especially in African American communities. A lot of them are actually the nicest middle class homes in those communities, but they're torn down anyway because of who lives there. In terms of the central business district, there are a lot of small businesses that are owned by white proprietors. Another big instance of contention is the construction of the I-630 through the kind of bypasses south of the central business district, and it destroyed basically the historic African American business section along West 9th Street in Little Rock.
So Monica, I'm going to interrupt you. We're running out of time, and I wanted to give Ryan a little bit of time to respond to all of this. And so maybe we can stay on past 3:30 or 4:30 or whatever time it is.
Thank you for cutting me off. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Jones-Branch, to your questions about Black activism, obviously, when we're talking about prisons, especially when we're talking about Cummins Prison in Arkansas, we're talking overwhelmingly about African-American inmates. Tucker Prison, which was built just a few years after Cummins was established, held mostly white inmates until the late 1960s and until the Holt versus Sarver decision. So some of the activism I'm talking about is it's led by African-American inmates. For Black women, finding Black women in the archive period is very, very difficult. I'm finding some things on African-American women in the Women's Reformatory. Eventually, white and Black women are separated. Initially, they're housed together, but eventually they're separated. And most what I'm finding is that overwhelmingly, they worked as, up until the 1950s, working as domestic workers for prison officials. During this early stages, well, not the early stages, but up until roughly the 1970s, 1980s, prison officials like wardens lived on prison grounds in buildings, many times built by prisoners. I mean, this is like, so a lot of times Black women did a lot of the same work they would have done under slavery. It's very, very similar. Your suggestion about the NAACP and the Aacw, I think is the other organization, that's something that I need to look at. The purpose of my dissertation, one of the central themes is looking at how African Americans were central to the reforms that did happen. So when you look at the end of convict leasing, typically that has been seen not just in Arkansas but across the South, as sort of came about through like the channels of high politics. So it comes about because the legislature decides, we're not going to support this anymore, or because of some activism from sort of white elites that are not really happy with the way the state is being portrayed, because sort of this information about how violent and oppressive this system is getting out. But I need to look at those, and I want to find good information that's going to show that they were behind, that African American organizations were behind the abolition of convict leasing, and also worked constantly to get prisons better condition for prisoners. I have a chapter in my dissertation that it's the last chapter, and it is about the federal prison built in Forest City. And that prison was built in the mid-1990s, and it was supported by a lot of the sort of new Democratic, a lot of new Democratic politicians, like Bill Clinton, like David Pryor, like Dale Bumpers. It sits on Dale Bumpers Boulevard, the prison does. And they were behind this. And in Forest City, this is a city that had been, or an area that had been dominated by agriculture for many years, that eventually agribusiness comes to take over and the number of agricultural jobs start to really, really drop. And so this was viewed as a way to deal with the unemployment crisis in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And that was a very contentious issue. The federal prison, the construction of the federal prison was supported by the NAACP, the local chapter, but it had a lot of pushback from some of its members saying, we don't really want that, here, we don't want the jobs, if these are the jobs that we're going to have to work at. We don't want to sort of contribute to, the rise in the prison population. Dr. Anderson, for your question, I am very much sort of guided by recent scholarship on looking at slavery as profitable as an economic system. I know that is not new, but it's sort of experiencing a revitalization. And I am very much inspired by sort of slave resistance. And I and looking at that initially, I saw all these similarities between how do, enslaved people resist, how do they contest the terms of their enslavement, and how do unpaid inmates sort of protest against the conditions of their confinement. And I was hoping to see a lot of parallels, and I did see some parallels, but what I saw also was that despite the image of the Southern prison as looking like it could be transposed 100 years earlier, it is very much on the front lines of what's the latest in agricultural technology, what's the latest in business management strategies, in employee management. I mean, and you could argue that a lot of these strategies come out of slavery itself, on how to maximize profits and things like that. But I did see that. In terms of prison labor as part of labor history, absolutely. That is something that I'm working on in my dissertation, is showing that not just that inmates were sort of inspired by labor unrest outside prison walls, and that labor unions, in fact, were very much behind, especially the abolition of convict leasing, mainly because convict leased inmates were competition for free laborers. The agricultural wheel was huge, founded in Arkansas, was huge behind the effort to abolish convict leasing in Arkansas. And so these labor unions, very much in favor of, keeping inmates away from jobs that might go to free workers, but you could say, that's a positive thing, right? It's a positive thing. But is it necessarily altruistic or whatever? There's some sort of reasoning behind it. But I do think, and I would like to show in my dissertation how these inmates are laborers, how they are working within a labor system, a labor regime, in which the amount, what they're paid is not in cash, but in some sort of other, how they're controlled is not by hiring, firing, or raising, lowering wages, things like that when there are no wages, but other ways that the prison works to control its labor force. So yes, that you're exactly right that, I hope to make these connections to sort of larger theoretical ideas.
I've asked in the chat if there are any questions from the audience. In the meantime, Professor Jones-Branch, Professor Anderson, do you want to follow up on any of this stuff? I know our time has expired, but I figured, none of us are meeting anyone at a bar in 5 minutes, so we can keep on going. Okay, Ryan, you might be meeting someone at a bar in 5 minutes.
Well, I actually wanted to follow up on something Ryan said, and I do have to go in a couple of minutes, not to go to a bar. I've got another meeting. But I was thinking about what you were saying about not being able to, find Black women's voices. The issue with that is, of course, that you have to think about where those resources might be outside of the traditional archives. In fact, historian Dr. K.T. Ewing, she referred to this as searching home archives, which is going to prove a little more difficult to do. But in terms of one way you can access women's voices is by looking at things, for example, like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs papers. So if you look at that and you look specifically for the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, they've got some pretty robust records within that collection that might lead you in the right direction. So I would definitely mine those. And I'm sure you're already doing this, but these newspapers and not just Black newspapers, white newspapers often have a lot of commentary from African Americans and their organizations, a surprising amount. It's not just them reporting all the negative things that are happening in Black communities. They're also reporting often about Black organizations and their positions on various things. Now, I mean, it might require some mining, not always, a lot of time, but not always. But it's been amazing what I've been able to find in a newspaper where I didn't expect them to give a flip about what I was trying to find.
Since I guess I'm sort of the chair, I'm going to ask a couple or make some comments if nobody minds. Ryan, play up the blood scandal. I mean, if there is a something about capitalism and the exploitation of prisoners, there's nothing like the profitability of bleeding.
Prisoners plus.
And then killing hundreds of Canadians and people around the globe. Andrew, there's one piece of information that I think you should know. Starting in 1949 in Sunflower County, Mississippi, it flipped from having a labor shortage to a labor surplus. That by 1949, mechanization had meant that there were more Black agricultural workers willing to pick cotton than there was cotton to pick. Gavin Wright talks about this in the 1986 book on the New South economy. It's based on an essay by a guy named Day from the 1950s. And it's really stunning. And so the question is, why, if there is in a period of agricultural surplus, surplus of agricultural labor, are planters in the Mississippi Delta trying to bring in more labor? And I think that's where Greta DeJong's book would be really, really helpful. One of the things that I'm working on is about braceros in Lincoln County, Arkansas, at the same time. And African Americans, whether it's Ethel Dawson, whether it's George Stith, were lining up and complaining about the importation of Mexican workers on contracts. And the literature is simply, like you said, that there was Black people didn't care. But Ethel Dawson, who I know Dr. Jones Branch knows quite well, she was leading the fight against the importation of foreign labor into the Arkansas Delta at the same time. And Monica, and I'm sure it's there, Acorn, is and the degree to which Wade Ratke and the people at Acorn, Arkansas Community Organizations for Reform Now, becomes the larger Acorn. It starts in Little Rock. It starts in 1970, 71. That is a biracial coalition in Little Rock. It mobilizes poor Black people that are really upset with the Charles Bussies of this world. And so I'm sure you're looking at that. And so these are my 2 cents for all of these papers. Again, anything from the audience, put it in the chat. Monica, I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
That's why it's breaking up.
I was just saying, I'm glad you brought that up. My whole 4th chapter focuses on Acorn coming in. And in fact, that organization was really important for mobilizing the fight against the I-630 project.
So have you talked to Wade Ratke? He will talk to anybody, and he is quite, oh, yeah.
Honestly, I didn't know he was still living.
Yeah, he is still around. He's running an organization out of New Orleans, and he is he will tell you all of the great things about himself. There's a reason that he is hated by half the people in Acorn, and he is seen as a saint by the other half of people in Acorn. So I mean, he is a fascinating, brilliant man who's a lightning rod, and so well worth your time.
Yeah. And I just wanted to make one more nod to Dr. Anderson's comments. Thank you. Yes, you're right. There is definitely a failure of neoliberalism somewhere in Little Rock. I'm still trying to figure that one out for myself, but I don't know. I still feel like they were really the prototype for how to, in fact, in the 60s, they were held up as the, I think the phrase was, everyone is going to Little Rock to see how to do urban renewal right. So they were kind of the model for like, this is how you should do it if you want to do it right. So it's, and then also your comments too about like all of the stuff that's seemingly coming out of Arkansas. That was one of my big takeaways from my dissertation project as well. Like Arkansas is very important.
Yeah, like the stuff Michael's done, you know, it's central. I think I would just play up, you know, really dig in and confront the literature on urban renewal and say, this is what you're doing. This is what the dissertation and the book eventually is. We're taking stock of it now. And especially because Cohen's kind of defended it. And, you know, what actually was it? You know, it changes a little in the mid 60s. And I think this could be a really important book or dissertation if you make that the centerpiece. And let's decide what it was. And, you know, who was hurt, helped by it, what was the class interest involved, the racial interest involved. And I just was very impressed by all 3 papers. But, you know, I have an interest in this sort of the urban South at this time and later. And so I was really captivated by it. And it can be really important.
I kept thinking of Tracy Newman's book on Pittsburgh.
Too. Yeah.
You know, and again, you know, there's a lot of good stuff in that book that could help you.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be.
Could you repeat the?
Tracy Newman's book on Pittsburgh. It's actually a comparison between Pittsburgh and Hamilton, Ontario. Yeah. It's about deindustrialization. And you know, one of the things is it's about the emphasis on Pittsburgh of pursuing ed and meds.
Yeah.
And you know, and the meds equation is there in Little Rock, but not the education. Yeah. Yeah. And that becomes, you know, and there's lots and lots of questions about I don't know the whole story, but the decision to put UALR, there was a movement to move it downtown at one time in the early 60s. And, you know, and I think the downtown leaders said, no, we don't want it down there. And it just, I think UALR has been cursed by that for close to 50 years.
Yeah. It's called Remaking the Rust Belt is the book, the Newman book. So.
Yeah, about 2016, University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, she's involved in this, discussion with like Kim Philip Fines about the neoliberal city. I think in the Metropole they have a conversation, and that's another place to position your work, which you mentioned there. But I think there's a lot to do with this. There should be like something on like the cities like Shreveport or Jackson, Little Rock, these southern cities that don't quite make it, and that's what and it was urban renewal, because all of them have an urban renewal project that disrupts African-American communities, that promises to revitalize the downtown. They all deindustrialize, and it's, a mess. And explaining it, I think, will go a long way to understanding the South we live in today.
Andrew, I just wanted to say one thing to you. I was just thinking, and I do have to jump off after this comment. I would strongly encourage you to think about either in the future presenting your work at the Agricultural History Society, since they are sponsoring this after all. And actually, I think the European Oral History Organization would be very interested in this topic as well, because you're talking about rural and agricultural history. And I could certainly see you on a panel with scholars from other parts of the world, talking about this and maybe what it looked like in other parts of the world. And they do welcome American scholars, right? I've been on there before. I'll be on the on a panel at the conference in the Netherlands, I think, in June. So just in terms of other spaces to talk about your work and to get ideas to help you flesh out ideas, I think those are a couple of good places for you to look into. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you all very much. I got to go. I got to get to another meeting. It's been a pleasure. You guys did a wonderful job. And I really was very serious when I thanked you so very much from the diversion from my full-time job. So take care. See you later. Bye.
Bye, Cherisse.
Bye-bye.
So I unless there's anyone wants to make more comments, should we call it a session? And otherwise, I think David and I would go buy you all beer in the lobby. But I swear, if you see us at the Southern next year, we'll buy you a beer in the lobby.
Promise. I just, all three of these, they're just well written and well researched, and I would just encourage you to go after, the next step is to go after like big historiographical points. And, I just think the future's in such good hands when I read this type of material, Michael. And I wish Jared was here too, and we would, tell him what a good job he's doing.
And Jeannie.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Is Jared in the audience?
Is he?
I don't know.
I don't think it tells us who's there, but
no, but he's not popping up in the chat. So
yeah, all right. But anyway, and Michael, good to see you again too.
It's good to see everyone. It's good to see you, Ryan. I haven't seen you in a couple of days. Monica, as always, it's great. David and Andrew, it's nice to meet you.
Yeah.
And so everyone, stay in touch.
Yeah.
This was really a lot of fun. It was great. All of you guys have great stories to tell. And I think David's right. You need to figure out, you need to, put it in the right historiographic context, because this is amazing stuff.
It is.
And it's just phenomenal. Okay.
Thank you both so much. I will definitely send a follow-up email for the book request again, because it was cutting out.
All right.
Here, I'll just put it in the chat.
Well, Mike, the other thing I was thinking on, you know, now that you brought up like the bracero, was like a ham of it, you know, that this work can go, Andrew's work with like Hamovich's work and migrant labor. And that's another theme that's, I mean, there's so many themes in each one of these, you know, that.
There's a whole literature about the importation of labor before the Foran Act.
Right.
But also, you know, there's a woman. She looks at contract labor going into the Greenwood Lake Village area several years before. I think her name is Braun. She, yeah, an Eric Arneson student.
Okay. He would know. Wow.
So,
all right.
Okay, everyone.
Good to see you.
Enjoy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.